There are more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles. And welcome to this, believe it or not, finally have gotten to. Jeremy and I cannot say we're any more excited because we're as excited as it gets to the Prepisode for A Sense of Beer Style on beer pairing.
And this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where that lights you and me up in the morning.
This is why we do what we do, Jeremy.
Totally.
And anyone listening, this is you too will be on that train if you're not already. And if you are, we appreciate being in good company. And I think to kick us off, it's kind of like why beer pairing. It's funny because this topic is as old as beer itself, right? People have not just been drinking beer in an isolated vacuum since the early eras, and they have been drinking and eating. We have still today followed that tradition, and the majority of beer enjoyed across the land, across the globe, is when it's with food. And so if you look at wine pairing, which truly has an entire industry behind it, and really knowledgeable practices, albeit it's really squishy because it's a personal world, right? Preference is personal, so pairing is personal too. You do, I think, have for the number one selling beverage, alcohol beverage in the world, the opportunity to formalize more on the pairing side of things. And so why pairing? A, because it can take you to amazing gastronomic places in in sensory delight. And because beer is an incredible beverage to pair with, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about. So maybe, Jeremy, with that, I'll have you kick us off with your letter geek out system that I can't wait for others to know about if they don't already. And it would start with A as the first letter in the alphabet, align intensity.
Yeah, absolutely. I love acronyms because it helps my brain think, especially when going after tests or trying to remember important information. It's helpful if I have that roadmap that takes me down there. So this is the ABCs of food pairing. A is really very simply the very first thing that I think we need to think about when you're trying to think about pairing anything. It's aligning intensities. There's a reason why we don't have little league baseball players go up against major league baseball players. There's a reason why we don't have an American light lager with paired with a beef stew. There's a reason why we don't have a barley wine with a summer salad. It's just because it's just overpowered. We don't need a Ford 450 just to go get groceries down the street. That's just too much power. So when we think about matching food and beer, we don't want the beer to just wash completely over the food or the food to just dominate. We want to add all the flavors together. We want to play with all the crayons in the crayon box. It's important to make sure that when we're talking about beer and food, that they are equal in intensity. Now, intensity can come from the malt intensity, the hop intensity, the alcohol intensity, the phenols intensity, just the overall intensity of the beer. But when we think about pairing that with the food, let's think about how big of an impact, that's another big word, how much of an impact the beer and the food has, and try to get those pretty reasonably aligned. And that's my take on aligning intensities when we're talking about food and beer pairing.
That's fantastic. And I think what I'd love to have you do is keep cruising, since the alphabet's not just A. And then I'm going to round things out from a different approach once you get through the main concepts, if you're willing. I think that's a good
sure,
one.
Absolutely. And because there a lot of people think about this in different ways. A lot of people basically these concepts are all pretty similar. We just organize them different ways. But so when I talk about the ABCs, A is line intensities, B is bridging those flavors, and then C is contrasting flavors, cutting flavors, cleansing. And then I add an S because if in doubt, go seek a professional. And that's just a way for consumers to, they want to put something together in an interesting way. And maybe you're not quite there yet. Well, this is where go talk to your cheesemongers, go talk to your butchers and bakers and candlestick makers and all that sort of stuff when you're trying to do this stuff. But so that's the ABCs in total. But when we come to bridging flavors, this is where if you have a flavor in a beer that is kind of reminiscent of like a caramelly bread or maybe like pie crust, and you have something in that food that has a similar kind of flavor, maybe it's like a sweet, deep fried type of flavor, then you have a kind of an anchor point of similar flavors that you can use to your advantage. And it's almost like a kind of like a swinging point or a balance point where you can use that where the beers and the food will go together. And from there, you can then do some interesting things. Contrasting flavors. This is where opposites attract. This is where, each brings something that the other doesn't have and really creates synergy. This is that fruity, bitter, double IPA and that fatty, buttery, creamy brie cheese. This is, bringing the two together makes just absolute perfection. Cutting flavors. This is where, when I think of cutting flavors, I think of if you have like spicy heat and maybe it's a little too spicy, you can use something that's creamy or something that is sweet, a lot of residual sugar to cut that back, to temper that back, to kind of make it a little bit more tolerable. Beers do this in and of themselves. You have beers that can get quite bitter, and if you have enough sweetness in it, then it will temper that. A good way to think about that is an American West Coast IPA is very hop and bitterness dominant. But if you think about an American barley wine, the bitterness and the hop flavors are going to be even more pronounced, but the malt is there to match it. A double IPA would have been a better example where there's more malt to match it to keep everything in balance. And to me, that's what cutting is just kind of keeping things in check so nothing comes out too strong or too harsh. And then the last of the 3 C's, cleansing the palate. A beer has a superpower that a lot of other beverages don't have, and it's carbonation, it's bitterness, it can be acidity. But the way that I think about cleansing your palate, it's almost like when you open the door and you're going on a date and you open the door and there he or she is ready to take you to the prom or a fancy dinner or something, just an anniversary, something exciting. And you're thinking, wow, I can't wait. Imagine shutting that door and wiping your memory and opening that door and again going, wow, I can't wait. Shutting the door and losing your memory and then opening the door again. That's kind of like cleansing your palate. If you have something that is too strong, too intense, too impactful on your palate will get fatigued. It will kind of shut itself down. We need a palate cleanser. Carbonation, to some extent, bitterness, to some extent, sourness also helps cleanse your palate. A good example would be like a pasta carbonara with all that rich, creamy, complex sauce. After a while, then you just kind of stop tasting the nuances of it. You need that beer with all the carbonation and everything to kind of scrub it clean, and then each bite is brand new and exciting all over again. And to me, that's cleanse. And lastly, like I mentioned, S is for seek a professional. If in doubt, go talk to people who know stuff. If you want to pair beer with cheese, go talk to a cheesemonger. And any type of thing, go to a good store, get a good book like Julia's. This is where you seek a professional. Those are my ABCs for food pairing.
Fantastic. And Jeremy's just thrown a lot at you in such an eloquent way. I'm going to reinforce a lot of what he said from the Julia side of things. And I do think it's good for review. So going back to, align intensities, intensity and pairing is half the battle. And if you actually are listening to A Sense of Beer Style, this Prepisode, then you won't see, if you are watching Zoom on this recording, you will see this slide shows you everything you need to know about intensity. And I'll verbalize it for you. There's a guy basically sucking on a lemon, and the veins in his forehead look like they're about to pop out. That's pretty intense, right? That says intensity to me. And then the other part of the slide is rocks in a very Zen-like, Buddhist style, almost balanced pose for things to show balance. And often when you do match intensity, right, we'll talk the side salad on your dinner, paired with an imperial stout is going to be a clash of intensities. That imperial stout's just going to, wash away any of the flavors, frankly, or many of the flavors in that salad. So you want to match intensities, equal level. That's why a lot of the time, your typical white wine Chardonnay will go with, whitefish in Beurre Blanc butter sauce, right? Some intensity, some richness, but that white wine is 12% alcohol, which is definitely more intense than most beers. And it's going to stand up to that type of sauce. So that's my version of intensity. And then I think it's super fun to get into the, when Jeremy brings up the bridges concept. And so, echoes, links, hooks, and bridges when you're pairing, that's what you're looking for synergy. You're looking to see beer to food or food to beer, the commonalities, and then they bridge together and often reinforce. And what Randy Mosher might talk about is potentiate, accentuate each other in a pleasing, positive way if you're doing good, in a clash way, and negative if you're not. But so I like to talk about flavor groups and flavor families, and I've listed some of those here. Rosemary, juniper, pine, and spruce. That to me comes from American hops, certainly as one flavor profile of American hops. Well, then you would pair a food dish, that fettuccine Alfredo that is dusted with rosemary, right? Or even parsley, I should have on this list, with an American pale ale, because a lot of the hops in that American pale ale are going to bridge or link over into that rosemary sprinkled on top of that very rich, intense fettuccine dish. Same with brown sugar, butter, caramel, maple syrup, vanilla, coconut, toffee. Can you hear all of those things really working in concert with each other? A lot of things that you might try food-wise have those. Maple syrup has the essence of vanilla in it, right? When you fry your pancakes on the frying pan, you're getting that sense of fried butter behind the drizzled maple syrup. All those flavors work really well together. And then pair that with an English-style barley wine, those pancakes in maple syrup, and you're going to be happy that Sunday morning. So that's the gist of the echoes, links, flavors, and hooks. And then to get where Jeremy was going, kind of from my side of things, and getting to the C's, right? And we've all heard a lot of these C's, and I'm actually going to share not my own personal resource, but the Master Cicerone current circa 2020 syllabus. And so this syllabus covers, and they finally just in 2021 added a much more robust way to flesh out the Cicerone program's version of pairing. I'm scrolling super quick. It's multiple pages. But if you get to the section of pairing beer and food in the Cicerone Master Syllabus, and you go to the actual, lexicon section, it covers multiple things. Whoops, I scrolled back too far. On the C's, it's not just the 3 C's. To Cicerone, they've got complement, resonate, harmonize, contrast, cut, accentuating, that potentiation I was talking about, canceling, clashing, and softening. Now, without spending about 10 minutes to really fully read this to you and describe what's going on there, I think it's really important to mention that any of those words that I just did share are often all happening at the same time. I've heard of pairings described as, this is a total complement pairing. I've heard of pairings described as, this is a contrast-based pairing. But frankly, all of that happens at once, and you just need to parse out what's happening most, and then you could say it's a complementing centric pairing, or it's this pairing's based on the contrast element most. Contrast, by the way, real easy, and from the Cicerone syllabus, mussels served with goose seem richer and sweeter due to the acidity of the beer. That's Cicerone's version of what contrast means. My version of contrast, because that's the hardest one to understand. We all probably can get complement. It ties to those flavor families and things complement each other and bridge over to each other. Contrast to me is really tied to the basic taste. In our Prepisodes, we're now talking about the flavor triangle, the three essences of flavor because it's a fusion, right? Basic taste elements, aromatic elements, and mouthfeel. Basic taste elements being sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami, emerging as oleogustus or fat. Well, those basic taste elements to me are mostly what come up when I'm getting a pairing. And so contrast is tied to the main basic taste elements as well as fat and alcohol to me in the experiential, version of contrast. Contrasting interactions can be good or negative. And that's what you want to pay attention to. How is that the residual sugar, which is a basic taste in the beer, working with that, cheesecake that's drizzled with strawberries that has so much sugar in it? They often does very well. So you wouldn't maybe call it a contrast. That would tip it over to the complement. But the acidity example, for example, with mussels served with goose seem richer and sweeter due to the acidity of the beer. When you have a different taste element in the beer or the food, contrasting against a different taste element in the beer or the food, that's when you get to contrast most, in my humble opinion. And certainly I know that is a lot. I'm still on a roll to round out a little bit of what Jeremy talked about. And I think it's good to kind of share a few more slides. And I certainly will verbally describe them if you are not watching us and you are listening to us on podcast, which we pretty much would expect most of our listeners to be. That's how you're probably finding us.
But just know that this is going to be on YouTube as well. And so if you want to go back and take a look, you certainly can.
So in the lexicon version, when you get to interactions, right, we understand interactions are based on, could be very intense or very nominal. The enhance or suppress happens to me. So intensify, accentuate, heighten, or brighten is the enhance, right? I'm off the top of my head, I'm thinking of something that can enhance the flavor. Maybe the bitterness in a American IPA, the residual bitterness enhance the flavor of that arugula, the bitterness of that arugula, and they work to accentuate each other, right? Then there's also, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, when I think about enhancing something, this is something that chefs do, good chefs do all the time, is they have something that finishes the meal. Maybe it's just a tiny pat of compound butter on a steak, or a little bit of salt, or if you ever have tacos, that's why the lime is there, is to brighten, intensify, accentuate those flavors. That's a common example that most people don't realize that's what that's for.
Great. And you just did trigger great examples. Salt will do that. Acidity will accentuate and potentiate big flavors. That's why you're not just doing lime, as Jeremy talks about on your fish tacos, but lemon is such a attribute in the chef's back pocket. And then the suppress component certainly is there. Diminish, soften, calm, or mute. One element in the beer can often diminish or soften. I talked about that Imperial IPA really negating a lot going on in a side salad. It's diminishing a lot of the bright, very delicate floral flavors from the fresh greens and vinaigrette, dressing. So those are really good, I think, concepts to get into. And from here, Jeremy, we certainly have more to cover. Why don't you take us onto the next concept of we've got, how to evaluate a pairing.
Well, and one of the things, just to tag on to that real quick, you brought up one of the terms from the Master Cicerone syllabus was canceling. That should be a fourth C on there, but it's kind of like an intermediate concept, but you kind of have to be careful. This sounds like a lot of it is just very subjective, and it really, really, really is. We're all going to taste things differently, but we do have the ability to be mindful when we try and put these things together, when we put these pairings together. But when we talk about how to accentuate stuff, how to kind of use food and beer pairing as almost like an art form. How can you enhance things? How can you create a mood? How can you do this stuff? This is the goal of musicians all across the world, is how can we convey something just through sound? we're trying to do the same thing with food. And that's where food pairing really comes in. But getting back to that whole cancellation effect and what you were just talking about, you can effectively mute things. You can cancel them out. One of my examples in that regard is people love like a chocolate cake or a chocolate mousse with an imperial stout. I'm generally not a fan of that pairing because the bridging flavors, the sweet and sweet, usually cancel each other out. They mute each other down to a level where all I'm left with is that bitter roastiness of the beer. That's one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of like chocolate cake or chocolate mousse with a Russian imperial stout, just because the sweetness usually cancels each other out, and you're left with that roasty bitterness that I'm not a fan of, generally speaking. It's not always true, but it's one of those things you have to understand that these interactions can happen. And so understanding how the ABCs work and all the extra nuances that Julia just talked about, being mindful of this will help you kind of begin your way. So when we start talking about evaluating a pairing, one of the things that I do that I've learned to do from Julia's book and other books I've read and different classes I've taken on the subject of food and beer pairing is really kind of take inventory of what the food is offering you and what the beer is offering you. What are the dominant flavors? What are the impactful things? If we're talking about a beer, we're not only talking about the flavor of the malt, but the intensity of the malt. We're talking about the intensity of the alcohol, the hops, the bitterness, the flavors, the finish, the carbonation, the foam, every aspect about that beer. What stands out, and if you were to inventory how much or how intense these are coming through, then just note that. And same thing, we're going to do the same thing with food, and start evaluating where those bridges are going to happen. If, for example, we take a burger and a pale ale, the burger is going to be rich in the savory, rich in the fattiness, and then who knows what we put along with that. If it's a barbecue blue cheese bacon burger, then we're going to have some different flavor evaluations to go through. So I'm thinking about all this stuff and what's going to bridge, what's going to contrast, how that's going to work. But keep in mind, it's all theoretical until we actually taste it and try it and see if it worked. If it worked, hooray for our team. If it didn't work, now you have the structure to go back and deconstruct it and figure out why didn't it work. You can evaluate it from such a way that, okay, I thought it would work, I was wrong, so why didn't it? And you can deconstruct it and figure it out. And that, to me, that's a valuable piece.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
and me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the Prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.